Hey everybody, and welcome to my second of two videos on this, the Minolta XK, X1 or XM, depending on where you live. In the first video, we took a look at all the buttons and dials and doodads on this camera, and I told you what they are. In this video, I'm going to look at exactly what all of them do, and I'm going to tell you how to use them all. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to load film into the Minolta XK. Here is the film back. To open it, you just lift up on the film rewind knob, and it pops open. Here is the film we're going to put in. You just drop it in like this, put the knob in place to secure the film, pull out a leader, load it into the film take-up spool like that, advance the film, and you can see now this is ready to go. So we're going to tighten up the film just a little bit. You want to take some of the slack out. You don't want to crank it till the film grinds or creaks, but taking it up like this is good. Now we're going to close the film back. Next thing we need to do is advance this to frame 1. So we just advance a couple times, and when the 1 is underneath the little triangle there, we are good to go. Now what you'll do is you'll take pictures with your camera until you get to the end of the roll. I'm going to open up the camera. Once you load film into your camera, don't open it until you've completely rewound it. Film is one and done. When it sees light, it either records an image or it can record nothing else, and any images you have on it are erased. So, but I'm going to show you what it looks like inside your camera when the film is moving through it. So as you'll recall, the shutter is right in here. So there's film behind the shutter. The film guide rails on the outside, as we saw in the first video, they prevent the film from moving up and down as it travels. And then you can see the silver guide rails underneath your sprocket holes that work with the film pressure plate to keep the film flat as it moves through the camera. You're taking pictures, you take a picture, activate the shutter, and now you advance the film. And you can see what it does is it pulls the film out of here and pulls it across the camera and takes it up on the take-up spool. Now you've used all 24 frames, remembering to keep your camera closed the whole time. You've used all 24 frames. It's time to rewind your film. So you push the film rewind release, oh, it's over on this side, button, there we go, and start rewinding by not incompetently flipping out the film rewind lever. When your film back is closed, it holds this cassette in place. But you can see that as you rewind it, the film comes off of the film take-up spool and back into your cassette. The button down here allows this sprocket to rotate backwards, which it can't do until you've pressed this release. Now, with your back closed, you'll hear a sound like this. That sound lets you know that the film has been rewound all the way. And what you would do if you were shooting and you had just used an entire roll of film is you'd rewind it so that the leader was completely inside the cassette. I'm going to reuse this film, so I won't do that. And then after you've rewound the film, you take the cassette out and you either develop it yourself or send it off to a lab to be processed. And that's loading the film, how it goes through the camera, and then unloading it and rewinding it and unloading it. The next thing we're going to do is change the batteries on this camera. This camera has an electronic shutter, meaning it has to have batteries in it to operate. The shutter will not work without batteries. So you'd really want to use like a nickel or a quarter. I don't have one on me, so we'll just use this lens cap to unlock the battery cap. C is closed, O is open. All you have to do is turn it that little bit, and now you can get to the batteries. The camera takes two A76 batteries. They're also called LR44. I recommend A76 because they're less prone to leaking over time, and LR44 are the lithium versions of them, but they're otherwise the same battery. See, this one's an A76 here. So what you want to do is you want to stack them like this. Now there's a handy guide inside your battery compartment. You can see the shape of the battery matches the shape in the guide. Just put them in like that. You know you've done it correctly if you're looking at the underside of the cap and you can read the text on the batteries. So we're going to put the battery chamber cap in with the red dot on O, and then you just push and turn until the red dot's at C and you're ready to go. Okay everyone, so there's a problem that happens with these XKs that can cause the shutters to jam. So if that happens to you, I'm going to show you how to fix it. The most common cause of shutter jamming on the XK is that there's not enough current going from the batteries to the board to complete the shutter cycle. So if your batteries are weak, the camera tells you because it just stops working. The camera does have one purely mechanical shutter speed, that's X, that's the flash sync speed. So let's take a look really quickly at how that works. I'm going to take the batteries out here, and if we set the shutter to X, now I can push the shutter release, and you can see that it works. But let me change it to 1/60th, for instance. Shutter's jammed upwards. This happens from time to time on this camera, even with fresh batteries. So the first thing to do when this happens is to try to put new batteries in. Now, if you put new batteries in and it automatically pops back down, that tells you that the issue had to do with the batteries being weak. Okay, so we'll advance the film here. If you put new batteries in, sometimes you might also have to change the shutter speed to X to get it to finish the mechanical cycle. Not always. Sometimes I do on this camera, sometimes I don't. But let's say you're out in the field and you don't have any other batteries. You only have the two that are dead in there. So you take your picture and your mirror locks up. I'm going to simulate having dead batteries by putting no batteries into it. Your XK comes with a shutter jam backup. So you've got dead batteries, the shutter's jammed open, not even X is working. You're going to change this from closed to open, and it goes back into place. There you go. So if your shutter jams, you have an emergency backup to unjam it by turning the battery from closed to open to back to closed again. It'll unjam when it's closed, when it hits open, but this way you can at least now set your camera to your manual shutter speed of X and be able to use it again. So even though you won't have full functionality on your camera, you'll have part functionality once you've unjammed your shutter. So let's say that your shutter doesn't unjam when you do that. It should, because I believe that's a mechanical trip in the camera. But if you know you have fresh batteries, they're inserted correctly, they work in another camera, you know for a fact they're good, and it keeps happening, that can be an electronics issue. So most likely your shutter staying up is a dead battery issue, but if it does it when you know for a fact the batteries are good, then it's worth having a professional look at it to see if there's an electronics issue or something that can be repaired or replaced in it to make it work properly. But the moral of the story is, just because your mirror sticks up doesn't mean your camera's ruined or shot, and it also doesn't mean, even if the electronics are shot, that it's not usable. You can only use it in X. But at any rate, that is how you unjam your XK. So before we even get into taking a picture, let's talk about some of the other things this camera can do and how to use them. One of them is this little dial up here. Now, if you're set correctly, there should be a white circle in it. Now, what that means, let's talk about what this dial right now means. We're set to 100 ISO, and we have a white circle in the window. That means we're going to get a 100 ISO exposure, and it's properly exposed. Now, if we lift this and we rotate it a little bit, we'll see a green 0.5. Come on. That green 0.5 means we're going to overexpose it a half stop. Now let's rotate it the other way to a yellow 0.5, which tells us we're going to underexpose it a half stop, and we can keep going, underexposing it up to, how far does this thing even go? Up to 3.5 stops. Now, we should be able to overexpose it up to 3.5 stops, but this camera doesn't want to do that. If you're shooting and you want to shoot at the ISO that you have selected, you want to make sure that your white dot is in the window. What's this for? Good question. So let's say you're shooting at ISO 100. You've got a very high contrast scene. You've got dark shadows. You've got really high highlights here. And what's happening is it might be throwing off your meter. And you can use this dial to adjust to compensate. The other thing this is for is, let's say that this is actually a better use for this dial. Some of the viewfinder prisms and some of the lenses that this can attach to require compensation. And that's really what this dial is best suited for, because you don't have to, because you can just adjust, you can just change your compensation here, and then you don't have to worry about figuring out what your proper film or shutter or aperture should be with the compensation required for that prism, focusing screen, or lens. The ISO dial on this is so easy to change that if you want to bracket your images, that's where you take one that's a stop underexposed, one that's properly exposed, and one that's a stop overexposed. All you have to do is adjust your ISO setting. So if you're using 100 ISO film and you want to underexpose one of your frames by 3, you just set it to 200 right there, like that. Next, that's 3/3 stops. So if you want to underexpose it by 1 stop, you're setting it to 200. Now, if you want to properly expose one, there we go. Now, if you want to overexpose one, you set it to 50. This allows you to bracket anywhere from, in this case, 1, 2, 3 stops over to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stops under. Obviously, if we're using 400 ISO, you can bracket 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a huge range, regardless of what type of film you're shooting, how much you can bracket your exposures. That's a pretty useful trick if you don't know exactly what your meter reading should be, or what your shutter and aperture setting should be, or if you, for some reason, don't trust that your meter is giving you a proper reading. You can compensate here for a few shots, and you can then make sure that one of the 3 shots you took turns out pretty well. Let's talk about how to change the prisms and focusing screen on this camera. To remove the prism, we need to push this button in the back and then just lift out. The prism's off the camera. I'm going to remove the lens because before you put a metering prism back onto the XK, you want to remove the lens, because you want to make sure that this little connecting doodad right here is not going to interfere with the lens mounting. And you also need to make sure that when you mount the lens, that the red dots connect. This meter's red dots, or this meter's lever, does not stay in position. There's a little way you're supposed to do it to get it to stick into position, and it does not work on this meter, unfortunately, which means when I load it onto the camera, I have to hold it like this. It's ridiculous. It's really painful. At any rate, so when you put this prism on, you want to make sure that the red dots are aligned. Now, to change the focusing screen, all you have to do is reach in there with your fingernail, or easier way that won't get a fingerprint on your focusing screen. Turn it upside down, push the prism release button, and then the focusing screen just drops out, and you can pull the prism off camera and clean the fingerprint you just put on your prism focusing screen off of it. There we go, much better. Now, to put your prism back, focusing screen back in, there we go. That's all there is to it. Just drop it in. Now I'm going to try to remount this metering prism so that it will meter properly. And that's how you change out prisms and change out the focusing screen in your Minolta XK. So let's talk a little bit about mirror lockup mode. Mirror lockup mode means that the mirror is locked up so that when you take the picture, there's no shutter shake. Now, that's a really great thing to have if you don't have to look through your viewfinder. So there are some times this will work. Astrophotography is a good use. Darkroom flash will work. If you know where you're going to be focusing and you just need to have a very slow shutter speed, like if you're going to be taking a waterfall photo, a macro photo, something with a long exposure, this works really well because it takes away the shutter slap vibration when you take the picture and minimizes or eliminates camera shake. So let's say you want to use MLU. First thing you need to do is hit the depth of field preview, and you'll see that this red these two red dots are here. Now rotate this forward and to line up the two red dots, and your mirror is now locked up. Your aperture is also stopped down, so you don't have any shake from your aperture being stopped down. And you can go crazy taking pictures with basically no camera shake. So another thing you can do in conjunction with this is to close your viewfinder prism. So we'll close the viewfinder's viewing shade right here. Now you can see that there's a shade there, it's closed. And you can now do a very long duration photo, such as an astrophoto, or a long duration macro, or a long duration waterfall photo, or anything else. It's star trails, things like that, where the shutter is going to be open a long time, and light cannot get through the back of your viewfinder. It cannot make its way past the mirror. This is a light tight box now. The only way for light to get in is through the lens and to the film. You've eliminated all other avenues. This is a pretty nice way to do long exposure photography. And when you're done, all you have to do is push that back in and it undoes the entire mirror lockup setup. So let's talk a little bit about flash photography with the Minolta XK. First, let's understand how a flash sync works. This has a shutter curtain, a two-part shutter curtain on the focal plane. So what that means, let's say you're going to take a picture of this scene right here. Your shutter doesn't open and close at different speeds based on your shutter setting. So let's say that this represents your shutter curtain. Okay, my hand going over here to the side represents the shutter curtain. If you push the shutter release, the shutter curtain opens, exposes your film to the scene momentarily, and then the second curtain comes in behind it and closes, okay? Then when you advance the film, they both together, actually with a little very minor overlap like this, go back across and reset. So at 1/100th of a second, what happens is your film opens, and that is the fastest shutter speed, where the entire film plane, what you're seeing right now, is exposed to light without any shutter curtain in the way. And then the second curtain comes in, closes behind it. At 1/60th of a second, same thing but with a longer pause in the middle before the second curtain comes in. And as you do other shutter speeds that are slower, the same thing happens. You have a longer pause between the second curtain coming in. Now let's say you're doing a 500th of a second. Your first shutter curtain will open, and then your second one's going to come in very closely behind it. At 1/125th, there'll be a lot larger gap. At 1/2000th, there'll be a very narrow gap between them. And so your shutter speed, it doesn't increase by the curtains physically moving faster. It increases by the amount of gap between the curtains and how long or how wide that gap is. So let's say you're going to do a flash photo. Well, if you do a flash photo at 1/2000th of a second, what's going to happen is your curtains are going to go and flash. Boom, you'll just have this part of the frame exposed with your flash, and then the rest of it will be black because there will have been shutter curtains in the way. So 1/100th is the fastest shutter speed, where both sets of curtains are open so that light can get through the lens to your entire film plane before the second curtain closes. Right here on the side is your flash PC sync port. So when you use a flash, it's going to plug in here because, as you can see, there's no hot shoe on this camera. So the only way to plug your flash in is with the PC sync port. You can use your flash at 1/100th of a second, as well as any shutter speed slower than that, down to 1/16th of a second with this ultra slow shutter speed setting dial. The last thing we're going to do is look through the viewfinder here. There we go. Now you can see the viewfinder is really pretty open. Okay, so here on that side is the light meter, and the gray band, the wide gray band, which is set right now at 1/250th, is telling me what shutter speed I have selected. That thin narrow one on the bottom, the black one, tells me what shutter speed I should have selected. Now if you set it to auto mode, and this is only for prisms that have auto, you can see down there in the bottom the gray line is set to auto. There we go. To tell you what your shutter speed is, or that you're set to auto. And there you go. Now up at the top of your viewfinder, Let's see if I can get it in here. There we go. There we go. There's a window that shows you what aperture you're set at. So you can look through and see at a glance your aperture setting. This prism has two CDS meter cells, and they take somewhat overlapping readings, and this is pretty standard to how the SRT system works. There's a meter cell that takes a reading up here and down here, and then there's a bit of an overlap between where they read. And I don't actually have a layout of the regions that these meter, but it ends up working as basically a smart averaging meter. So it takes the reading and it assumes that you're looking at a 15% gray area, and then it figures out what your shutter speed and aperture should be to obtain the best exposure. And because it has two cells, what it's doing is it's figuring out your bright areas and your dark areas and compensating between the two to give you a good overall general exposure. I just called it an advanced averaging meter. It's also in a lot of ways a rudimentary matrix meter, and that's its only mode. There is no other metering mode with this camera other than that one, at least with this prism. So let's put everything that we've seen together and talk about how to take a picture with this camera. Okay, so we've got the film loaded, and we're going to set it to 200 ISO because we're using 200 ISO film. Next thing we need to do is focus on our subject. Okay, that looks good. That's in focus. We saw in the viewfinder the thin black line that tells us that we need to have a certain shutter speed. Let's say that shutter speed that it told us to have was 1/15. Well, that's way too slow. We're going to get shutter shake. So let's move it up to 1/125th. And now we're going to adjust our aperture right here on the lens to get to a setting that allows us to take a picture at 1/125th. Okay, great. So we're there. Next thing we're going to do is actually push the button and take the picture. So that's the standard manual operation. If we wanted to shoot in auto mode, all we have to do is set it to auto, select the aperture, and then the camera is going to pick the best shutter speed. So let's see, here's the lens at f1.4. You could hear that was a pretty quick shutter speed. Now let's set it to f16, the far end of the lens's range. And you could hear that was a much longer shutter speed. So the camera is figuring out in auto mode what speed it should use. How about double exposures? Double exposures get a bit wonky. So now let's say that we're right now we're at f5.6. You can't see that, but take my word for it, we're at f5.6, and we're at 1/125th of a second, and let's say that that's what we need our exposure to be to get a proper exposure. When you put two exposures on a frame, you need to cut the amount of light for each in half. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. If you're using a manual shutter speed, just change it to 1/250th. You don't really want to adjust the depth of field because that's more important for creative control in most settings than shutter speed. Let's say that you're using auto mode though. So if you want to cut the amount of light in half, all you have to do is set it to 400 ISO for your two double exposures. Oh, you want to do 3 on a single frame? Okay, you can set it to 1/800th, or to 800 ISO rather. 4, that's getting a bit gonzo. It's not really going to turn out very well. Going beyond 3 is going to start to give you very diminished returns. So those are your two different ways. You can either manually compensate your shutter speed selection or increase your ISO by 1 to cut your light in half. So we're going to go with 1/250th at f5.6 for our first double exposure image. We're going to take the picture. Now we have to advance the film. This is where it starts to get a bit tricky. You're going to have to hold this right here, push the film rewind button on the bottom, and while you're doing that, advance the film. Now we're going to go and take our second picture. It could either be the exact same setting, and we're going to just take it, or we could go out and now it's a lot brighter, and the camera's telling us we need 1/1000th of a second at f5.6. Well, again, we have to cut our light in half, so we're going to go with 1/2000th of a second. Take our second picture for our double exposure. Now we're going to advance the film, And what happens when we advance it is the film rewind button on the bottom pops out, the film starts to re-engage, but it doesn't engage until after the film advance motion has started. So you need to take a dead frame. That means putting your lens cap onto your lens, setting your aperture down as far as you can if you want, and setting your shutter speed to the fastest you can. And you take a dead frame, now you advance, and now you've got a slightly larger gap between frames, but you aren't going to have your next frame overlap the double exposure that you just went to a bunch of trouble to take. So the dead frame on this camera is very important to prevent image overlapping when you take a double exposure. So that's it. That is the Minolta XK, the single highest grade professional camera in terms of system elements that Minolta ever produced. It is a phenomenal, amazing camera that you don't want to take hiking because it weighs as much as a small car. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track and that I'm producing content which is helpful and useful to you. If you have questions about this camera, please leave me a comment. I'm pretty good about responding fairly quickly. If you are an amateur photographer who has taken photos with this camera, please feel free to share a link to your photos if you would like in the comments. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do that by clicking the subscribe link, and then you'll find out when I have more camera and film and photography related videos. One last thing before we go. Thank you very much for watching.